Colin Seal, once a self-proclaimed underachiever, found his academic stride once he began to think like a lawyer. Imagine a world where every student is encouraged to understand.
Just because I can doesn't mean that I should.
Discover how his journey from being a middle school math teacher to becoming a lawyer led to the creation of a transformative education approach that emphasizes both critical thinking and challenging the status quo.
For the first time ever, school wasn't about memorizing stuff or regurgitating information. We owe it to our kids to be able to figure out a pathway to get them exactly where they need to be without like being held back by that very real fear that these kids can't.
Welcome to the School Leaders Project, a podcast series dedicated to helping school leaders make positive changes in their schools and communities. In every episode, we talk to extraordinary thinkers and doers about their experiences and experiments with teaching and learning. The School Leaders Project is an initiative by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. Toddle offers a truly comprehensive experience, so all of your big picture planning flows seamlessly into day-to-day instruction, assessment, reporting, and even parent communications. We started as a passion project in a school that thought, hey, our teaching tech should be as cool as our teaching teams. And we're now loved by more than 1,500 progressive K-12 schools all around the world. With all that said, let's jump into this conversation with Colin Seal. I'd love for you to set the stage for our audience and just let us know a little bit about who you are and the work that you do.
Sure. Well, I'm Colin Seal. I am a middle school math teacher at heart, but I think my story starts as really being a recovering underachiever. And as a kid who had a lot of academic potential, but not a lot of interest, not a lot of engagement, I think I'm one of those teachers that once I became a teacher was doing it for a lot of reasons that we don't see that often, which is that for me, it didn't really work for me. And it didn't really work for me until this interesting experience in life where I was teaching math during the day in Las Vegas and going to law school at night at UNLV, which I would not recommend to anybody with a brain. Like, do not go to law school and teach at the same time.
It's insane.
But for the first time ever in life, I did extraordinarily well academically. I graduated top of my class because for the first time ever, school wasn't about memorizing stuff or regurgitating information. The whole thinking like a lawyer model that I was learning in law school was a space where I was expected to be thinking on my toes and playing all the angles. And it is really and truly the first academic space where the set of skills that we tend to refer to as street smart finally had academic value. And when I started using those same strategies with my math students, it's like their brains exploded. And I realized this is a really powerful framework. So for the last 8 years, I've been leading Think Law, where we're a critical thinking focused organization that's really trying to close the critical thinking gap in education. And we do it through our supplemental curriculum that uses real life legal cases in upper grades, knowing that when we tap into our kids' sense of justice and fairness, they get to talking, they get to thinking, and it really unlocks their critical thinking skills. But as early as pre-K kindergarten, we use fairy tales and nursery rhymes because there are a lot of very questionable characters in children's stories. Like, did you know Jack and Jill had a third stanza? You know, Jack went home and got help. What in the world happened to Jill? These are the things that we get kids thinking about from a really young age so that when they're doing Thanksgiving in kindergarten, instead of doing that age old exercise where they're taking a hand out, tracing it, and coloring it into a turkey, they're doing a turkey pardon case where they're making a case as to why their turkey should be spared execution by the President of the United States. That's the level of like what we're trying to pull out of our kids. And really, our bread and butter has been helping schools use their existing curriculum to do this. So it's not about our curriculum. It's about how do you create these constructs for teachers so this critical thinking process doesn't feel like one more thing. Instead, it becomes the sole way in the universal design approach to make sure every kid has access to critical thinking in the classroom.
I love that. So that's kind of how I found you. So I was looking at the World Economic Forum, and they listed analytical thinking and creative thinking as the top two skills of the future that our students will need. And you're the only person out there who I've seen creating a framework around this. So I'm curious, you bring up this idea of the age of agility. Can you tell us a little bit more about the age of agility and what that is and why we need to know about it?
So I think there's so many times you can use like different buzzwords in education, right? Like, and if you don't define it, it gets kind of fuzzy. So I appreciate the chance to be able to clarify what that means. But I think, you know, you look at the fact that at least in the United States, a lot of education pension systems are set up for these 30-year careers. But we know in real life, like
Hmm.
people are not staying in the same job for 30 years. And sometimes like the same job field isn't even going to be in existence. Like I look at things like my best friend's mom owned a travel agency. Cindy, a travel agency. Like my kids can't even
Right.
contemplate what that even means. Like, what do you mean a travel agency? But that's where you used to go to get tickets. If you didn't want to go to the airport, you had to go to a travel agency. And you know, we had a job. We had a job in fifth grade, so we can get a limo to the prom. Mind you, the limo was free. But you know, we had to do. We had to organize flyers because there was no websites. So we had to organize the flyers for the places in Europe and the
Gosh.
Caribbean. And I'm thinking about like the age of agility means that things are changing so much faster, so much more rapidly. And if you
Hmm.
actually want to make sure our kids are prepared for the skills of the 22nd century, one of the things that really, really makes me think is a lot of the tools that were important in the 19th century now become important. How do I learn how to learn? How do I learn how to unlearn? How do I learn how to relearn? And being adaptable, being flexible, being in a space where we know that like the power of computing and artificial intelligence still requires a really strong human component. And I say this as somebody who graduated with a degree in computer science from Syracuse and taught math
Mm.
in middle school and high school. If we want to think about how we're going to protect ourselves from the robots, it actually it's going to be the humanities. It's going to be the humanistic
Right.
aspect of stuff, even in the ways that we humanize math and we humanize science. And if we really want to get our kids ready for this era where things are changing so rapidly, we've got to think about, hmm, what happens if our kids learn to actually be the change? Like to make it really clear, like a lot of us went to school to learn about the way it was, the way things are. It's just the way it
Mm.
is. We really get our kids ingrained the idea of being ready for the age of agility. We start asking these questions about how it ought to be, how it ought to be, not just the way it is, but the way it ought to be. So I'm not just doing a lesson where my kids are learning in financial literacy about the aspects of the United States credit system, but I'm getting them to a point where they're starting to like criticize and analyze, like if they were in power, like what would they do differently? Like how would that work? And I think in my second book,
Mm.
Tangible Equity, I talk about a chemistry teacher who had a very different kind of chemistry classroom than I've ever seen. What's the one thing you see in every chemistry classroom?
Lab material?
Well, it's on the wall, something on the wall. Every chemistry, it's always the periodic table of
Oh,
elements.
periodic table. Yep.
Always, right? In this case, he didn't start the year with that. Instead, he started the year with the kids analyzing the properties of different atoms and looking at it. And then the kids had to
Mm.
sort them into the organizational structure that they thought made sense. And then they learned about the table, like, oh, I guess that can work too. And what that is like, okay, this is the way it is, but I actually have the power to understand it the way that I choose to understand it, the way that makes sense to me. And something as
Mm.
simple as that is really getting kids to understand that they're not just sitting here as passive learners. Who they are, their biases, their preferences, their expertise, all of that ropes into creating a much more humanistic experience in their learning process. And it really does like create this power of like making them be more critical thinkers by default because they realize that they have
Mm.
creations, they have ideas, and they have the power to critique other people's ideas in that process.
I think what I'm hearing there is that a key component of critical thinking is ownership, is empowering students to feel ownership over their learning. Would you agree with that?
So this is definitely the lawyer in me. But a part of what I always do is I try to pick apart different words, right? So one of the things I argue a lot is that we got to be careful in education with the word empower because it implies that kids don't have it already. Like they already have the power. The
Mm.
question is, what am I doing as an instructor to allow them to use the power, to hold a mirror up to them so that they can see that they have that power? And I think, you know, we break down the definition of critical thinking skills. There's really like four components to it. So the definition of critical thinking does include skills like the ability to think analytically, the ability to interpret, the ability to analyze, or even to think about your own thinking, which is metacognition. But it's more than just skills. It's also your dispositions. In other words, the habits and mindsets of critical thinking. So how likely is it that you'll apply the critical thinking you have throughout life, academics, and career? This is where we get these folks who like are unquestionably brilliant, but do dumb stuff all the time. You're like, what's going on? Right? Well, what's happening here? And
Mm,
a lot of times the difference between knowing better and doing better is having the skills but missing those dispositions. And one
love
of the things
that.
that's really interesting is like, Think Law, we're coming out with a whole volume around mathematical content, right? Because we know mathematical thinking is so important. Because thinking like a mathematician is different than thinking like a historian. Thinking like an engineer is different than thinking like a librarian. And the reality is, critical thinking is very context dependent. So, as a lawyer, when I was doing a case in construction law, I had to think like somebody that worked in that field. Same thing when I worked in a case involving like a credit card cash advance company for casino software. So like I had to get all up in the weeds of it. So critical thinking is very context dependent. And here's the kind of kicker. Here's the thing that I think really separates the way that we're talking about critical thinking versus a much more like textbook definition. Critical thinking doesn't work just for the sake of critical thinking. It
Mm,
has to be grounded in this construct that we're in a society that focuses so much on getting the right answer. Critical thinking also includes a level of analysis of understanding that doing right is more important than being right. Doing right is more important than being right. Meaning that if I could think about a world, Cindy, where every person was raised to understand just because I can doesn't mean that I should, we'd have a very different world. Can you
mm.
imagine, like, just because I can doesn't mean that I should? So we require that level of analysis as part of our critical thinking structure. And we look at this as something that's not just some, you know, textbook checkbox kind of thing. Because if we get people to understand just because I can doesn't mean that I should, it's kind of also getting them to live on that edge of just because it's the way it is doesn't mean it's the way it ought to be.
Mm. It feels like there is so much wrapped up in this, right? So I hear perspective taking, I hear ethics, I hear morality, and all of this is connected through this piece of critical thinking. Do you find that that's overwhelming for teachers, or how do you break down those skills and dispositions further?
So, what I actually think is the current model of teaching is overwhelming. I think the current way that things are done is overwhelming. I think that there's this level of like we know the importance of the importance of social emotional learning, but how many schools do you know that are like, okay, kids, come on, gather around, it's SEL time? Well, that's madness. If we're really doing
Right.
SEL, we should think about ways that like it doesn't feel like one more thing. It's actually a core aspect of the academic instruction. Every time you ask kids to take different perspectives, if I'm asking, hey, was Alexander the Great really all that great? And I'm doing it from the perspective of the people that he conquered and people that he ruled alongside, and from
Mm.
women and from people that were in deep poverty during that time. Like that's building my level of empathetic understanding and my ability to make connections and to see things from different perspectives. Um, you know, when we look at kind of what's big here, I say if you look at most of ed tech, um, like especially ed tech from like 2015, 2016, it seemed like there was a lot of solutions coming out that really annoyed me. They really annoyed me because it seemed like a lot of what they were trying to do was replace the teacher. And I found it offensive. I found it very offensive. And what really bothered me even
Mm-hmm.
more is like, how come nobody's talking about how to embrace the teacher? How to make this work easy? Here we are in a field where it can often feel like if you're not going above and beyond, you're not doing enough. What would it mean if you actually had things that simplify your process? What I've noticed, Cindy, and this is actually a really important thing for your audience because differentiation is another big like buzzword in education. And I think we learn about it very incorrectly in teacher prep programs. I think the idea of differentiation that I was taught was this idea that like okay, if I have three different levels of kids, one group will do Form A, which is like the lowest kind of rigor form. The one group in the middle will do Form B. And then Form C will be like my complex word problems, my challenging problems, my writing prompts. And in reality, Form C is literally the only assignment that actually hits that standard at the level of rigor and challenge that's required. Like that's the only form that gets there. So
Right.
how about we realize it's not about Form A, Form B, Form C. Everybody must do Form C. So what I'm differentiating is the pathway to get them there, but I'm not differentiating the outcome.
Mm,
Differentiating the outcome leads to horrible inequities. Where
right.
when I went to Syracuse, and this is the thing, like I grew up as one of the kids we don't serve very well in public education. I grew up on free and reduced lunch. I grew up with a dad who was incarcerated for selling drugs. I grew up in an immigrant family. And the thing about it was, they had kids I went to college with who were valedictorians of their high school, and they were taking remedial everything. They were
Mm.
not prepared. They did every single thing that they were asked of. But what they were being asked wasn't enough. So when I think about the injustice that ensues from that, I think like we owe it. We owe it to our kids to be able to figure out a pathway to get them exactly where they need to be without like being held back by that very real fear that these kids can't.
I'm hearing a deeply humanizing process here that every child can, right? But it might just look different. It might be a different process. It might be a different product, even, but that our expectations stay high regardless.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that nobody says, I hereby declare that I have low expectations for children. No one says that. Okay. What happens is they look
Mm,
at the data and they're just being realistic. And when they say these kids can't, they don't mean these kids can't really. What they really mean to say is, I have no idea, practically speaking, how to create the learning conditions such that all kids can. What sounds like a gap of will is
okay.
actually a gap of skill. So, like, we could talk all day about mindset, but I much rather focus on skill set. And that's what a lot of our curriculum helps us do. That's what a lot of our books and professional development is all geared towards. The skill set of what it takes to build the environments where all kids can do a low floor, high ceiling model of critical thinking.
Beautiful. I'd love to talk a little bit more about kind of your origin story, right? Because you began as a teacher and then went back to school to become a lawyer. So I'm curious, as you were doing both, right? You're teaching math, you're in law school. What were some of those aha moments for you?
So the presumption of expertise was number one. Was number one. Presumption of expertise. You know, I can ask you to use your gut feeling to tell me something like, hey, when is it okay to hit somebody without getting in trouble for it? What are all the reasons you could think of when it's okay to hit somebody without getting in trouble for it? And kids can rattle off like, oh, like self-defense, if they hit you first, if you're trying to protect other property or whatever. Maybe if they consent to it, like if you're doing boxing or you're playing football, like it's okay to hit somebody because it's whatever. So like you can ask that and expect that kids have a level of expertise. But somehow there's this thing of when you go into an elementary school math class or a middle school science class that kids need to sit there silent and learn exclusively from you as if they've got no clue what any of this stuff is, as if they can't make any
Hmm.
sort of gut connection to the work that we're about to do. And I think that the idea that in law school you'll be expected to hold your own with a professor for 45 minutes at a time about a topic you just read and could barely even understand was this thing of like, you know what? Nobody is afraid of productive struggle in law school. Productive struggle is the whole point. It's the whole point. Being on your toes was the whole point. That pressure was the whole point. And I think there's this level of like, when I look at education, I'm always saying that it's not just hard work, it's heart work. We have to address the feelings of it. We have to address like the fears that come with it. And when we look at those fears, sometimes there's a fear that like kids might have their self-esteem hurt. There's a fear that kids might get like really, really frustrated as they're doing this, but I don't know. We just got back from Dayton, Ohio, the home of the Wright brothers. And it's very interesting. The Wright brothers tried to fly this plane hundreds of times. And it was so ridiculous that people started just watching them fail. And I'm like, man, do we have that level of commitment? Are we allowed, are we willing to allow kids to go to that level of struggle if they're invested in something? Or we be like, okay, enough is enough. I'm just going to give you the answer. Enough is enough. We're not even doing this task anymore. Just do this
Mm.
easier form. And I think there's a level of like realizing, you know what? We've got the power to make sure that kids experience that joy of getting that light bulb moment and not taking it away from them. And it's part of the reason we work with parents and families as well. Because in my own family, my mother-in-law, we're out to breakfast one time, and my daughter loves going to brunch because she could get to put an ungodly amount of syrup on her pancakes. Is what she does. It's just what she does. The syrup comes out, and she tries to pour it out with her right hand, and it wasn't coming out. She's like, "Oh, that's weird." Moves it to her left hand, but still no syrup is coming out. And I could see her, like she's not giving up. Like she's got that eye of the tiger, like it's you and me, syrup, and it's not going to be you. She's into it. And then she's probably starting to realize that for this syrup to come out, it has to be completely upside down because it's so thick. But before she has her moment of glory,
Mm.
her sweet, sweet Nana is like, "Oh, come in, let me do this for you." And I'm like, "No!" I scream so loud. Everyone in the restaurant freezes. All the waitresses are staring at me like, "Yo, who's this crazy dad?" And I had a couple of thoughts, two thoughts. Number one, maybe I overreacted. But number two was this is where it starts. This is where that sense of learned helplessness starts. When you decide that
Mm.
because of your ego and your need to kind of feel helpful, you're going to deny somebody of the very intrinsic motivation that comes from the joy of productive struggle, the joy of accomplishing the task that you set out to independently. And my whole thing is like, we got to be able to help without being too helpful. We need to be able to understand that balance. And I think the pressures of time constraints and everything can make me feel like I don't have the time to wait for you to give me an answer. There's even a thing when I do adult learning, when I'm working with teachers and educators, they expect that if they answer something and it's not quite right, I'm just gonna move on to the next one. I'm like, no, I'm gonna stick with you. I want you to work through it. I'm not just gonna give up on you like that. You've got this. Think about it.
Is that the biggest mindset shift you think when you're in schools? Is this leaning in to failure, to embracing that vulnerability?
So I'd be remiss to talk about all this stuff we're talking about, right? Like, yes, living in the failure is important, but there's a prerequisite question that's really important to address too. And it goes back to my background story. So I was a kid that, in addition to all
Mm.
the challenges I had growing up, I also was like, I'm not going to say I was a bad first grader, but I was gifted at being bad. Like, I went above and beyond. I put in a lot of effort to be kind of a little bit nightmarish. And I remember um, I also had a very bad speech impediment. And as I'm getting evaluated for services, it turns out that I was supposed to be in the gifted and talented program since I was in kindergarten. Okay.
Mm.
It turned out that my behavior challenges came from a lack of being challenged. And I'm sure a lot of people that are listening have met that kid before. But what really
Absolutely.
gets me is this. When I got bused to this school, and mind you, I had to get bused because there was not a gifted and talented program in my Brooklyn, New York neighborhood. I had to go in a different neighborhood in Brooklyn to go to it. I had a transformational educational experience, but the biggest transformation of all was that I didn't actually change. I did not change. It just so happened that in this
Mm.
classroom space, me asking questions all the time was no longer disruptive and disrespectful. It was required for what it meant to be inquisitive and curious. It just so happened that me telling the teacher, hey, we shouldn't do it this way, we should do it that way, was no longer willful defiance. It was now required for what it meant to be a leader and an advocate. And I cannot talk about the importance of critical thinking and unlocking brilliance in our kids and all this stuff without asking a very important prerequisite question. Do our kids have the psychological safety to be brilliant? Have we created the psychological safety to be brilliant? And when I say this, Cindy, I want to be even one level further. Do our adults have the psychological safety to create psychological safety for
Mm.
children? Because I've been in so many spaces where you've seen this heavy hand since No Child Left Behind passed the United States, where like, hey, it's 10:15 p.m. a.m. Why are you not on page 11? Right? There's not a lot of psychological safety when you have to do everything by the book and you can't adapt anything to the kids in front of you because you're afraid of getting in trouble. So psychological safety isn't just some buzzword, it's a prerequisite condition for critical thinking. If I don't feel safe, if I'm so worried about getting the answer wrong and being embarrassed about that, psychological safety sometimes looks like I've seen these classes that have this kind of thing where, like, oh, go to this side of the room if you believe this, if you believe that, based off of something having to do with a character in a novel. And every kid is on one side of the room because no one feels safe to disagree. Psychological safety means I might just disagree just because. Just because. Like, disagreeing is good practice. It's good practice to be able to, like, make an argument that you don't even really agree with. Just for the practice of empathizing with where somebody is coming from.
I think you hit the nail on the head that compliance culture is the death of inquiry. And if a teacher is feeling squeezed from above, that culture is going to trickle down into the classroom. So as leaders, we need to be opening the doorways to saying, there is no expectation that you're on page 11. There is no expectation that everyone has the right answer. But that's really hard to balance that with the testing culture that exists. Have you found that that is a big barrier for schools?
So here's what's really weird about it. And this is what I cannot understand. The tests that we see in the United States, particularly today, are not like tests from 15, 20 years ago. You cannot pass these tests without critical thinking. There's no such thing as teaching to these tests.
Mm.
They require a lot of high level application, they require a lot of critical thinking. The question is like, when the author said this, they most likely meant, like, that's a very like subjective kind of thing for me to sort of think through and think in that perspective. And like, I don't know why it's either or. Like, the critical thinking is the means to that
Mm.
end. Like, if you focus on critical thinking, if you focus on making sure that every kid can do the most challenging form of that content, that test will be a piece of cake. But we haven't really adapted
Right.
that. A lot of our like tier one instruction is still formatted and delivered as if the tests look the same way they did 15, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And they don't. And our world is not the same as it was 15, 20 years ago either. So,
Mm.
yeah, I mean, at a very practical standpoint, um, we actually, one of the more practical solutions we have to close on that rigor gap in tier one instruction is to encourage every single teacher at every school to actually take the standardized exam at their nearest grade level. So you teach kindergarten, first grade, whatever. Take the third grade exam in math and reading. Take it. Look at the level of rigor they'll be
Mm.
expected to do in just a couple of years. You teach seventh grade, take it. Even if your subject isn't a tested subject, still take it to understand, well, what does the rigor of my social studies question need to look like, given the way that they're being asked about certain kinds of things in nonfiction text on their ELA exams. And when you realize there's a
Smart.
gap, there's like nothing more practical to understand what the need is here.
I love the idea of a staff doing that together and then reflecting. If we're beginning with the end in mind, what assumptions did we have and what were challenged by this experience?
And I like the idea of
Very
just
cool.
demystifying this idea. I don't care if you believe standardized
Yeah.
tests are racist or whatever, it's still just a test. It's still just a
Right.
test. And I refuse to believe that like there is some sort of inherent reason that black and brown kids and kids in poverty can't excel at a really high level on a test. It's literally just a test. If they knew how to do the stuff that's on that test, they'll be fine on a test. If they had regular access to the kind of
Mm.
rigor in class every day that was actually above the level on that test, they'll be fine. Like, this is not mysterious. And also, my
Right.
second book is called Tangible Equity. And the reason that I call it tangible equity is I wanted to be very clear about what equity is. When I call it equity, I talk about the work
Mm.
that we do. that reduces the predictive power that demographics have on outcomes. Equity is the work that we do that reduces the predictive power that demographics have on outcomes. So all over the world, we can say these things like,
Beautiful.
up the hill, down the hill, like past the underpass, the trailer park over there, that place beyond the interstate. The students on my roster who speak that language or that skin color or come from that poverty level or have that special education designation. And I'm like, too often we have these negative outcomes that follow people in these patterns based off of demographics. And I'm like, you know what? In education, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way because we can actually
Yes.
reduce that predictive power. And if we're truly honest about that, we got to name some stuff. We got to name that a big part of why I went to grad school for free. Not just for free, but got paid to go to grad school on top of going for free. It's because I scored almost a perfect score on my quantitative GREs. A big reason why most of my law school is paid for is because I got in the 97th percentile on my LSATs. Like, this is access creation. When our kids learn how to play the game,
Mm.
they get in a position where they have the chance to slay the game.
Very cool. I'm so glad you brought up your second book because the term equity has become, unfortunately, very highly politicized. So, are you facing any pushback when you're in schools having these kinds of
I've
discussions?
literally never heard a single educator disagree that the definition of equity that I'm using
Right.
is a fundamental part of the belief of why education exists to begin with. The idea that we should be reducing the predictive power that demographics have on
Absolutely.
outcomes, like that's the kind of definition that makes things so clear in people's head. I think that there's a challenge when you use words that don't reflect the work. And if you're in a district or a school system or a community
Yes.
that like is having a problem with the word equity, who cares? It's not about the word, it's about the work. What you're doing is like increasing access and opportunity. If what you're doing is providing a tier one educational experience where everyone has access to rigor, like whatever it is, just say what it is. Like I prefer you don't use the word equity. Say what it is. Make it clear.
Hmm.
Because you can have all the acronyms in the world, and we love, word soup in education, but actually say what you're doing.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring this up is I talk about this in intangible equity as well. Like there are people that would look at an eighth grade algebra one program, okay, and be like, okay, it's good to give kids access to algebra one in eighth grade. But if I'm looking at my school and the demographics of my eighth grade algebra one class look very different than the rest of the middle school, right? It's more affluent, it's more white, it's more
Mm.
Asian. And I'm like, well, this doesn't add up. So there are some folks that say, well, in the name of equity, let's get rid of eighth grade math algebra one altogether. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Equity doesn't mean everybody gets nothing. Equity doesn't mean everyone gets the same thing. And if you really care about equity around disrupting that predictive pattern that demographics have on outcomes, let's admit the predictive pattern that parents with means are probably going to find a way to find a way. Like they're going to find a way to get their kids access to advanced math
Mm.
one way or another. Kids that don't have the ability to do that won't. So if you really wanted to do something that will be equitable and disrupt that pattern, you would do the work and commit to what's necessary to design a K through 7 sequence where every eighth grader would have a meaningful at bat at Algebra 1 in eighth grade. That's what you would do. That's what equity
Mm.
would be. But if we don't define it clearly, we end up with these weird outcomes that are not reflective of what equity work actually requires.
So much of education, I think, is just getting everybody on the same page of what we're talking about because we do hear a lot of buzzwords, and your definition is so great for that. Can you say it one more time for our audience?
Equity is the work that we do that reduces the predictive power that demographics have on outcomes. So if you notice any trend in your building, oh, these kids are being disciplined a lot
Amazing.
more with more severe discipline. These kids are not doing as well. Kids in this, like, you can look at that and be like, all right, how can we change this? If we change this, then it'll be no longer be the case that this pattern would be a true thing anymore. What would it take to change it? And that's where, like, you got to get really creative. That's where you start, like, making every idea doable. And what I love about this process is I also, another phrase that I sort of reject, and this is not very popular. I know a lot of people spend a lot of money and resources on this concept, but I really am kind of tired of the concept of implicit bias. Implicit bias,
Mm.
this idea that there's always some kind of subconscious thing, whatever. I'm like, maybe it's helpful from an academic standpoint, but I actually prefer to talk about explicit bias. And here's why.
Mm.
Every one of us has heard some version of these kids can't. My whole thing is if you say these kids can't, let's talk about it. Which kids can't? Which kids do you feel, and why can't they? And here's the power of shifting from implicit to
Mm.
explicit bias. I remember I had I had a certain kind of privilege when I first started teaching, and every new teacher has it. It's called new teacher privilege. And by the way, the word privilege is something that I
Mm.
also have a problem with because I like to think about privilege as something that's very relative. And if we were really honest about privilege, we realize that it goes so much into who we are and our cultural connections and our capital that comes from our positionality. So first year teachers have privilege. You have the
Mm.
privilege to do whatever you want to do because people are like, oh, okay, go ahead and do that, stupid first year teacher. And it's actually a great
Yeah.
license. It's a great license, right? You don't have past experience to tell you what can't happen. And I remember, I'm like, you know what? A lot of my kids are struggling with math. But I started to notice a lot of my
Mm.
parents also reflected very bad narratives about math at home. Or my mom doesn't know how to do math either. My mom hated math too. My dad hated math too. So I was like, you know what we need to do? Let's have a math family night. A math family night where we come together and we solve word problems that are all like real world problems that are more about mathematical thinking than computation. And it's the kind of mathematical thinking I swear to you, our parents and families do every single day. And I got laughed out of
Cool.
my math team meeting. Like, what were you talking about? Parents are never going to come to that. I'm like, really? Like, yeah, that's a really. I was like, so can I just ask a follow up question? Like, well, why won't they come? Well, a lot of my parents have a whole lot of other kids, and I'm like, so what if they could bring the kids? Well, a lot of our parents like don't even speak English. Most of them speak Spanish. Like, what if you did it in English and Spanish? A lot of parents they got to make dinner. They got
Mm.
to do whatever. I'm like, what if we had food? And like this idea of like
Mm.
leaning into the explicit biases, those explicit assumptions, essentially doing what we call a
Yes.
pre-mortem, like all the reasons why something won't work,
Yeah.
and being like, okay, let's address those things. Let's address these things. If you weren't honest about your feeling about why they wouldn't work, we couldn't address it. But now that we're addressing it, we're having this program and we're having to pull chairs out of different classrooms into the library because so many parents showed up.
Cool. It's having that open dialogue around it and not being afraid to say, this is what I assume. What do you think? What might be a solution for this?
Right, right. And when you talk about explicit bias, it's
Mm.
things like, again, demographics, patterns, and reducing that pattern. We frequently see a thing where like certain kinds of parents are not at school. We want them to be at school. Right? Like, man, how come this parent's not showing up to
Mm.
this thing? Or how come if I'm looking at who are my involved parents, why they trend to be mostly affluent? Why am I not seeing more black and brown parents involved? And there's this idea that I didn't realize it until I had kids myself. And then I heard a speaker talk about this. You know, we ask why don't teachers, parents come to school? Why don't these parents come to school? We never ask that question of like, what if for some of our families coming back to that school is like returning to the scene of a crime? What if our
Mm.
parents had their own educational trauma? I tell you, I have a really hard time being in my daughter's parent teachers conferences because she's a lot like I was, and a certain kind of feedback that I hear them saying where I'm like, I can't do this. I can't do this. When she's writing out her goals for the year, for the next semester, and one of her goals were to like to not get taken off of line. It was her first goal. Like, I mean, what do you mean not get taken off of line? Well, when we're lining up to go to lunch, like if I talk, I gotta like go back to my seat and go back online. I'm like, huh. And so the expectations got to be level zero, completely silent when they're walking into the line before they go in the hallway. I'm like, okay, how many things are actually at level zero? And you start realizing, like, okay, so like, when did talking become a felony? And I'm like, you know what? I gotta go. I
Right.
gotta go. I can't be here for this. I can't do this. I can't do this because it's like, it just reeks of the kind of control that was trying to be rendered over me when I was a kid, and
Compliance.
it's hard for me to be a part of that. But like, the whole remedy
Mm.
there is though, like, what if we did parent programs at community centers? What if we did parent
Mm.
programs outside of the school? So like we came to them instead of like us coming, them always have to come to us. Like what would that do to set the power levels in a way that felt
Mm.
more equitable, make people feel more comfortable? Hold on one second. Yes.
Awesome. I can cut that part out
Okay.
later, no worries. Uh, so much of what you're saying to me resonates with this concept of the distribution of genius versus opportunity. And ever since I read that on your website, it's been this idea that's just been kind of stuck in my head. So, might you talk about distribution of genius versus distribution of opportunity?
Sure. So I talked about how I was in this gifted and talented program and I was being busted at school. What I didn't discuss was that at PS 208, the average elementary school class size was 30 plus kids. My class was
Oof.
only 24 kids. But honestly, it was actually second slash third grade, third slash fourth grade, fourth slash fifth grade, which means that in this program that I was actually bused to, and most kids were bused to, they only identified 12 kids per grade level to give access to this transformational experience. So when I looked at that and I thought about what that meant, it hit me at a very young age that brilliance is distributed equally, but opportunity is not. Brilliance is distributed equally, but opportunity is not. Opportunity is not. And the thing is, some people might hear that and be like, well, wait a minute. I don't know. I don't know that all kids are real brilliant. And here's my question. How many of y'all that are listening know some super, super dumb people who have PhDs? I do. I do. PhDs, masters, bachelors. I know a lot of people that you would describe as not that bright, not that brilliant, right? So the idea of like
Mm.
opportunity is the real point. The whole point is if we presume some baseline level of brilliance that is capable of being nurtured, then we got to obsess with the opportunity. We have to obsess with that opportunity. And I thought about something more recently that I hadn't thought about before, about what that actually means. I had a kid one time. His name was David. David was a kid who, like, he was the textbook of, like, I don't know what's up with this kid. So smart, but like, oh
Mm.
my God, he would say some things. He'd be like, what in the world? The behaviors are ridiculous. One of them kids who like never got to do field day, never got to do any tricks. It was always something. And he would say things like, he told the science teacher once, hey, anybody ever tell you you look better with the lights off? Like ridiculous stuff. And I remember one time he was like asking me to do some recommendation letter for him to do some like summer college program. I'm like, you crazy? Get out of here. Never. Ridiculous. And I remember talking to a teacher, and I was like, hey, can you believe that David would have asked me to do this thing? And she let me have it. She tore into me. She's like, what is wrong with you? What do you mean? She's like, Colin, the only one thing you should be doing if a kid like David is asking you for access to this college program is write a glowing recommendation letter where you just lie your butt off about how amazing David is. Because you know what David needs? He needs an opportunity. He needs to be out of this
Mm.
environment. You know what that would do to his life? And I just thought to myself, why am I playing the role of gatekeeper here?
Right.
When I can be somebody who can create access. These people at this program don't know who I am. They don't care. Like, why don't I just create a thing where a kid who has like actual really solid grades because he's a very high achiever, why am I letting my ego get in the way of his opportunity? I can't deny his brilliance. In fact, I'm
Mm.
actually being a true hypocrite because I had a lot of behaviors that were just like David's. And there's this level of humanizing this work where I could have just sat here on this podcast and give all the examples of all the times that I've done amazing things for kids. But I'd rather talk about the time that I nearly really failed a kid because of my ego and my pride and my willingness to demonize instead of obsessing with creating opportunity. And we all have the power to create opportunity. We all have the power to obsess with unlocking the treasures that are within our kids. Are we willing to use that power?
As you spoke, I almost imagined like every child is like an ember, and they're in the world, and some are born in these just like rainy conditions, and they're just like fighting to keep that ember lit, but that doesn't make it any less bright. And that's our role, is to kind of feed that fire and feed that flame.
Yeah. And I think there's a level of again, part of the reason why I say it's not just hard work, it's hard work, is that there's a level of willingness to commit that comes with this work. I think it's a big reason why I started going bald at 21 years old. Like this is heavy, heavy, heavy stuff. Like I remember I had another student named Precious. And you already know if a kid's named Precious, ain't nothing precious about that situation. You already know how that's gonna go. Okay. And she was amazing at solving word problems. She did not believe she could do word problems, but I always started every year in math with word problems because I figured you get that out of the way, then it becomes the standard for the rest of
Right.
the year. So she's sitting front and center of me on a test, and right in the middle of the classroom, right in the front, hand on the test. She looks at it, and she looks right at me, takes the test. She crumbles it up and throws it on the floor. And I'm like, are you serious? So what do I do? I take it off the floor. I like flatten it out. I put it on the desk. I'm like, yo, you could do this. Like, no, I can't. I know how to do this stuff. Throws it on the floor again. I'm like, you just were doing this yesterday. And as veins are popping out of my head, and I'm going back and forth with this kid until she actually starts to do it. I thought to myself, I'm willing to fight that fight every single day, multiple periods a day.
Hmm.
And I thought, is that normal? Is something weird about me? Because I know for a fact that when I refused to do work when I was in high school, nobody fought it. Nobody cared.
Right.
Nobody cared. I had a kid in my pre-calculus class, sat front and center every day with a piece of paper, not a sheet, a piece of paper, which is all he had every day, just a little piece of paper. And he did absolutely nothing, front and center, smiling at me gloriously as he did nothing. And I'm like, well, this isn't going to work. I called his mom, and his mom respectfully was like, Mr. Seal, F him. I'm like, really? Like, yeah, the last time I told him to do his homework, he called child welfare on me. So, all right, okay. She hung up the phone. And I'm like, I guess it's me and him. He was really good at the drums. He was on the drum line. Just so happened that his music class was during my prep period. So what did I do? Showed up to his music class. He's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I love music. I love drums. And I just was here to watch you do the drums. And he's like, you just gonna sit here and just watch me do the drums? Like, you sit here and watch me do pre-calculus? No difference. And he's like, fine, I'll do your work. Just don't come back. But don't forget, I do like the drums. I love the drums. So just know, this is my prep period. I could be here every period, every day, every day. And it's this level of like, again, prep periods are important for teachers. Like, why am I willing to do this? It's because I know what opportunity means. I know how smart this kid is. I know how smart he is. And I'm like, for some reason, he got accustomed to performing in this way where he's not doing anything, but he's so capable. He's brilliant. And I'm like, I cannot leave genius on the table. I can't let it happen on my watch. But we let it happen on our watch so often in education. But what if we didn't? What if we didn't? What if we made a condition like, no, we're not allowing this? And sometimes I think about like, I work a lot in comprehensive high schools. Everyone complains about a lack of student engagement. But we don't talk about the feeling. We don't talk about the feeling of the fear of like, hey, when I ask a kid to do something, I don't really want a kid to snap back at me and give me all this attitude. So I just rather just kind of whatever. You want to just be there on your phone and put your hoodie on, whatever. But I thought, like, what if as a team you decided that every single one of us was going to do a three-pronged like warm invitation strategy where like we teamed up. Usually it's only two or three kids in the class that's like really refusing to do something, and we gave them at the beginning of class like, hey, we're doing this right now, whatever. Hey, just want to let you know this is what we're doing right now. Like you could do this every day. I bet you money that by that second day they'd be like, listen, I don't know what y'all got going on, but stop talking to me. I'll do your stupid work. Just leave me alone. Just stop talking to me. Stop inviting me to do work. It's annoying. But like we make it too comfortable for people to like just sort of like
Mm.
chill out. And sometimes they chill out because of the lack of psychological safety. Maybe they're struggling
Right.
with something and they don't feel safe kind of admitting they have that struggle. But once they get into it, it's hard. It's hard. And a lot of times, like, man, I even have the idea of like, what if we started doing more like student, like teacher meetings, not student teacher parent meetings, student teacher meetings, where all seven of his teachers talk to him at the same time and tell them that they care about them and they want them to achieve at a high level and they believe in them. Like, if you're willing to make that time and do that, it's hard for a kid to be like, well, these teachers don't care about me. But
Hmm.
if we just let kids every day just kind of whatever, like, I don't know, we could be leaving a lot of brilliance on the table. And a lot of times, I don't know, that's not doing a lot to disrupt that predictive pattern that demographics have on outcomes. Like, we really need to push on that.
So much of your work, Colin, feels so empathy driven and so connection driven that there is an assumed power in your communities and your students, and you're just making that space and time to remove the barriers and just provide as much opportunity as possible. Is that kind of is that the key to your work, you think? It's just making that space for power?
I believe that a lot of what we're doing is sort of just restoring the human condition of learning. Like, when people
Yes.
tell me kids can't think critically, I'm like, well, let's unpack that a little bit because anyone who's ever seen an infant knows that infants come out of the womb thinking critically. They're exploring, they're wandering, they're asking. Once they get a voice, they use that voice to ask all the questions, and at some point they're told that questions are bad, questions are annoying. And
Mm.
I think about like pre-K, first grade, kinder stuff. You know, it's a pretty traumatic lesson we have, and I think a lot of people are familiar with this text, but it's a very traumatizing text, so a trigger warning. Um, it goes like this: three blind mice. See how they run. See how they run. They all ran after the farmer's wife. She cut off their tails with a carving knife. Have you ever heard a story in your life like Three Blind Mice? And the question we ask our kids in this traumatizing thing to start off is to start off by, like, again, acknowledging their expertise. What's hard about being in kindergarten? And believe you me, Cindy, kids will tell you their trials and tribulations. Okay, they will tell you how hard it is to be in kindergarten and have to have all these rules and deal with all these kids and all these little chants and stuff they got to remember. And then they ask, what's hard about being a kindergarten teacher? And kids are surprisingly empathetic. They're like, well, you gotta deal with kids like me. Like, they know what's up. They get it. But now they use that same thinking when they do Three Blind Mice to be like, okay, what's hard about being a blind mouse? Again, they can just
Mm.
start using their common sense. Like, okay, it's probably hard because it's harder to get to the cheese. Maybe you're more susceptible to like the cat chasing after you because you might not see where the cat is coming from. And then it's like, what are some alternative reasons they might be running after the farmer's wife? I'm like, well, maybe she smelled like cheese. It's not always about you, lady. And these are the kinds of things that from a really young age, our kids can start to think about things and incorporate their experiences. And I had a chance one time to be in an elementary classroom in Las Vegas where they had the flip question, like, what's hard about being a farmer's wife? And it's like, I don't know, maybe you're married to a no good farmer. You walk around smelling like cheese all the time. Maybe you're like, upper body is all sore from churning all the butter or whatever. And ask a question like, well, why do you think the farmer's wife like cut off their tails? And people had different predictions about why, maybe whatever. And one kid stood up on his desk and was like, I know why. And I'm like, why is he on his desk? What is he talking about? He's like, she cut off their tails so they can go back to the little mouse friends and say, I did this to you. And I was like, wait, what? What? What kind of thing is that? That's wild. But what I loved about it was a level of fun and joy they were having and analyzing this thing at a really young age, where we're normalizing the idea that text is not neutral. Text is what I make it.
Mm.
And in this world, we talk a lot about culture responsive pedagogy. It's important that our kids can see their stories and their lives and their nationalities and heritage and ethnicities reflected in different texts. I say that, and I know that to be true. But I would argue that it's equally, if not maybe even more powerful, if we help kids develop the skill set they need to find a little bit of themselves in everything. In everything. If you could find a way to connect everything to who you are and how you are and why you are, it changes your learning experience. So one of my favorite books in high school was Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And the thing about Jane Eyre is like, this is a time in life that I was going through a lot of struggle. But I'm like, this chick is really going through some struggle. Like, man, like, so there's this level of like most black boys from Brooklyn are not talking about Jane Eyre like that. But it really like it hit home. You know, we read Charles Dickens like A Tale of Two Cities, like it was the best of times, it's the worst of times. And before we started analyzing the book, they're like, yo, like, what examples do you have where you could think about something that was like the best and the worst at the same time? Where you had that level of like that convergence. I was like, ooh, that's a good question. It really got me thinking. Like it really got me thinking because like I remember like as a huge fan of hip hop, I remember it was like the '90s, like the mid '90s when I really got into rap music. But it was also when like Tupac and Biggie were shot within months of each other, and I was like, so it was like the best of time because I was
Mm.
learning to really love this art form and this culture and whatever. But it was the worst of times because like we lost two of the most talented people that we ever had in hip hop history so early, right? So like I can make that about me, but it's Charles Dickens. So like
Right.
there's a level of like we think we do culture responsive teaching because he made up a math problem about Tyrone going shopping for Kwanzaa supplies. But it's really about making sure that kids can really dig deep and find aspects of their stories across the content, no matter what they're doing.
We're moving, I think so much of the culture of schools is from this factory model, this model of compliance. And shifting away from that, like you said earlier, that if we're going to battle the computers, we need to lean into our humanity. And so finding ways that curriculum has resonance and relevance to our learners versus just compliance and follow the rules really is the path that we must walk.
So hold on a second. Factory, okay? We are educating, and this is why I don't like that we compare ourselves to other countries. Like the countries we compare ourselves to are so homogeneous, and a lot of them don't actually even attempt to educate everybody. At least in the United
Right.
States, we say that our goal is to educate everybody. You don't speak English as your first language, we'll still educate you. You have any kind of special needs, we'll still educate. You just came from a war-torn country and it interrupted schooling for 2.5 years, we're still going to attempt to educate you, right? But I think about the factory model and I'm like, look, there's no other way to approach educating the amount of kids we need to educate without something that can be done at a high level of scale, right? Like, so that's something I know to be true. We have to
Mm-hmm.
be able to do something that can be like repeatable. We got to hire so many teachers that like we got to have something that feels like we can like create a system around it. So it gets me to think about these systems. And you know, I was just watching this documentary because I'm always on the road, always traveling, and it was about Hitsville, USA, which was one little house in Detroit that started Motown Records. And I was really surprised to know, you know, one of the most popular songs that Motown ever made was I Heard It Through the Grapevine by Marvin Gaye. But you know what was really surprising to know about that? Smokey Robinson had already done that song. Gladys Knight and the Pips had already done that song. They had already released it. They were already kind of successful with those songs. But they did it again. They didn't let good enough be good enough. They challenged each other. There was this culture of collaboration and mutual challenge around what they were doing, where they would currently be like, that record is all right. It's good, but I think it could be even stronger, even though it was already a hit.
Mm.
And I think about this idea of like, if a factory could be responsible for creating the sound of a generation, this was the sound of a generation. It couldn't be categorized as just black music. It was the sound of a generation. There are people that were born in that era that's like, that's the music I grew up with. And it came out of this little house in Detroit. And you're like, you start naming these names, like Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross. It's like, it's so many people. And you're like, wow, how does that happen? It's because of the nature of the factory. It's because of the values of that factory. It's because of the way that factory creates a lot of psychological safety for people to take risks, for people to really go there,
Mm.
people to do things that are really different, people to not settle for good enough as good enough. And I think about what that would mean if we realize something that I talk about intangible equity, something I didn't realize until maybe I was in my 30s. I spent a lot of my life complaining about, oh, the system, the system. It's just the system. The system is so messed up. I never stopped to realize, wait a minute, I am the system. If you are in education, you are the system. The people you work with are the system. And when you decide to understand that you have the power to actually change the direction of that system, to use your critical thinking, to use your values, to guide the way that the system ought to be, instead of just always focusing on the way it is, it creates unprecedented levels of power. And I'll give you a very concrete example. We got a partnership with a lot of schools all throughout the country, but a lot particularly in Kentucky. And there's this place, Taylor County, Kentucky, where a middle school was doing one of our Think Law lessons. And this lesson was about vaping. And we do a whole root cause analysis around vaping and the teenage use of vaping. And there's a big problem with like the amount of advertisements that are being put in front of teenagers around vaping. And even as cigarette usage has gone down, vaping has gone way up. And in this exercise, kids have to do a whole root cause analysis. They ask why several times, and they come up with their solution. And as like the activity at the end, they've got to write a letter or draft an email. And it's usually an assignment that people just sort of do to kind of show how they would draft this email. But in this particular middle school, they decided to actually email their representative, Representative Pollock of the Kentucky House of Representatives. You know that the very next day, this dude showed up to class? He showed up to class
What?
because it's not a very often thing that he's getting 60 emails from any constituents about anything, much less seventh graders.
Yeah.
And I thought about what that would mean, Cindy. I thought about what that would mean if when I was in seventh grade, I did an assignment in school that resulted in my elected official coming to school the next day to hear more and learn more about the problems that I identified. I don't even have the right to vote yet, but I have the ability to change things. And in the world, we talk so much about like motivation and engagement in school. You've heard that phrase, you can lead a horse to water, but can't make him drink. When we can ground the way we approach instruction around this inherent sense of fairness and justice, authentic inquiry, we make that horse so thirsty, it has to drink. It just has to. There's no way. Like this is that thing that like when you walk into certain classrooms and like you realize nobody is saying like, this could be on a test, we're getting a grade for this. It's different. There's a different level of engagement when we're moving like this, right? Like I would even argue that this creates a biophysical miracle. When you're teaching like this, when your instruction is like geared up this way, all of a sudden no one has to go to the bathroom. It's miraculous. I don't know why. It's like all their bladders synchronize around this content and like no one has to go to the bathroom. So that's really what we're trying to go for here. Like a very practical approach to creating these experiences in classrooms every day. And when I say every day, I'm not talking about some specialized lesson, which like a lot of middle schools, a lot of high schools, a lot of elementary schools that use morning meetings or advisors or homerooms, they use our curriculum very often because it's a very solid, low prep way to get these conversations going and getting teachers to practice these kinds of questions, creating that muscle memory. But even when we look at our model for PD and that comes out of our books and our approaches, we got teachers at a high school, one teacher at a high school, teaching U.S. government, started class with a question. What would it look like if every state had its own currency? And these kids are like, I don't want your stink Illinois money. And they're going back and forth. And it's all this joy in this like speculative kind of inquiry. Okay, they don't know anything about today's lesson. Today's lesson happens to be about U.S. monetary policy. And that intriguing question got them intrigued in a relatively boring topic. And the whole thing about it was, this is one of those things where I did a training on a Monday, walked to school on a Tuesday. And at the end of that visit, when I was talking to the school leadership, and I told them the most exciting thing I saw all day, and I told them who that teacher was, their jaw dropped to the floor. They were like, what? That teacher? That teacher who never tries anything new? That teacher who the kids are always like, please take me out of this class. I don't want to be in this class. Yeah, that teacher. And I recognized something there.
Mm.
That joy that I saw, it was her joy. And it rubbed off on the kids. Everybody joined teaching to teach this way. Everybody imagine these experiences where kids would be like hopping out of their chairs, whatever. And then you're like, you got these deer in the headlight looks, and like, what in the world is this? Wait, you mean kids actually literally hate math? Like they hate it? You have kids crumbling up a test paper and throwing it on the floor? Like that's where we're at? But if we could restore the humanity of this work, it's not just about the kids, it's about us. It's about our sustainability as
Mm.
educators. It's about how we feel fulfilled as leaders. We could walk into a building, I could walk in a classroom, and guess what? Kids are laughing and learning at the same time. Because it shouldn't be a privilege for kids to laugh and learn at the same time, but it feels like it is, especially as kids get older.
Mm. Beautiful. It's beautiful work, Colin. And I think that's an amazing place to pause. I've got one final question for you in the lightning round. So, my final question for you is, what is your superpower?
My superpower is I've got reflection abilities. I'm really, really, really good at helping people see their powers, their superpower, especially when it comes to educators.
Mm.
You know, when I first started doing a lot of this work, I would get a lot of pushback from classroom teachers. And the pushback wasn't the kind of pushback you would think it was. The pushback was like, Colin, I'm just a teacher. I'm just a teacher. And I heard it so much, it started to really, really bother me. And as someone who I said was a huge fan of hip hop, I started thinking about the power of just a teacher. And I started thinking about this idea that like Jay-Z, one of my favorite rappers, had a teacher who told him that he was an incredible, incredible writer. When he was in sixth grade, he was reading at the 12th grade level. He had a teacher who brought her to their fancy house. And I mean, I don't even know how it even happened, but he tells the story in his book like it's an incredible experience in his life of seeing this different realm of how the world could be. And this idea that like he always knew he could be something because of this teacher that had this power. Then I think about another rapper, the Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, who had a lot of similar things to me, where he had parents from the Caribbean. He had problems in high school, but then he started dealing drugs and he got locked up. He comes out. He ends up being this really incredible rapper. Cross paths with this executive producer, Sean Puffy Combs, before he was called P Diddy or Diddy, whatever he chooses to call himself right now. Um, and he ended up having a single, first album, first song released, and the single was going to be hot. He goes back, he's doing the ad libs. And the very first word to use on his first album, on his first song, was to dedicate it to his teachers. The ones that always had his back, the one that always believed in him. No. His first words on his very first album, on his Mama I Made It moment, at the moment that he's interrupting that demographic pattern that demographics have on outcomes, he dedicates it to the teachers who always told him he'll never amount to nothing. So every time I hear teachers say, I'm just a teacher, I feel like a lot of the work we do is to help them see themselves as someone that has the power to unlock magic, but also has the power to crush young souls. So we got to choose carefully. And we
Mm.
know that we have a lot of power. We know that that can have a lot of impact. So we got to really see ourselves as inherently powerful. And it's something that I try to allow us to do. I don't care what curriculum you use. I don't care what grade level you're in. I don't care who your principal is or what district you're in. You've got a lot of power in education.
Beautiful. I think this is an episode I'm going to go back and listen to quite a few times. It's like everything that you say can be unpacked and can be kind of thought of from different angles. So I can't wait to listen back to it. And I just really appreciate your time today, Colin. Thanks for coming on.
I appreciate it.